Welcome to Hot Topics. This is a monthly discussion of the events and the ideas that excite us and energize us, or that may also keep us up late at night. My name is Cecilia Barocas, and I'm part of Indivisible Illinois 9, the sponsor of this event. If you are not familiar with Illinois 9, we are one of hundreds of local groups committed to taking action to actively support progressive values and candidates. This year, we're committed to taking back the White House and Senate, expanding our numbers in the House, and supporting progressive candidates for local offices. Each local group has its own priorities within the framework of the national movement. And here in Chicago, we're focusing on 3 states with one mission: get out the vote in Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Here in Illinois, we were really determined that Marie Newman would win the Democratic primary race in the 3rd Congressional District against Dan Lipinski. And we did it. We knocked on thousands of doors, made thousands of phone calls, and got voters to the polls to throw out one of the most regressive Democrats in the House. Marie won. And we helped make that happen with our voices, and I also might add our sore feet in midwinter. We broke up a decades-old political dynasty and helped elect a great progressive who will win in November. And between now and then, we're also working hard here to re-elect Sean Casten and Lauren Underwood in our neighboring districts. Also here in Illinois, we're working to pass the Fair Tax Amendment. So we Illinois will join the many other states with a progressive income tax that distributes the tax burden more equitably and making sure that everybody pays their fair share. Third, we pledged to pull out all the stops to turn Wisconsin and Michigan blue in this national election year. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we've lost some of our most powerful tools, unfortunately. Door-to-door and face-to-face canvassing and exciting live events. So we've ramped up other actions, including postcards and phone calls to register voters, to educate voters on the critical importance of this election, and to make sure that people vote and vote blue. And this brings us to our purpose in being here tonight with you, to hear from 2 Wisconsin activists who are doing some of the heavy lifting needed to turn Wisconsin blue. And I'm now going to turn the mic over to Nick Rapkin of Indivisible Illinois 9, who will introduce our guests and our format for this evening. Nick, let's go.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. For the next half hour or so, I'll talk with our 2 guests. You can put your questions or your insights into the chat in the meantime, and Cecilia will monitor them, your entries, and then she'll ask Angela and JP your questions during a Q&A that'll follow our initial discussion. We'll wrap up about 8:15 or 8:20. Zoom can focus on who's speaking if you use speaker view, but for the moment, I'd like to ask you to use, what's it called? I want to see everybody, and I want you to see everybody. Because I want to do what you might think of as a quick poll. It's widely believed that just three swing states, part of the Democrats' blue wall in 2016, that flipped and put Trump in the White House. Those states were Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. There are literally dozens of theories about why those states flipped in the last election, and those theories are important because flipping those states back requires that we know why it happened. Tonight, we'll be talking about our closest neighbor. Of those 3, Wisconsin is the only one, is the one that may be the most competitive today, and the one that Trump absolutely needs to be reelected. There are reasons for optimism, and there are also reasons for us to worry that Trump could take Wisconsin again. And we'll hear about both of those from our guests. But first, this is the reason I'd like you to see everyone. I want to do a little poll. of this group that has gathered. I know that some of you are already working hard on the election, and others may have come to find out more about how to get involved. Others may have come just to find out more about what's going on the front lines to our north. Can I see a show of hands? Those of you who are already doing work of any kind at all on this election, wherever you are, raise them up. JP, you qualify, yes. Okay, great. Okay, if you are texting, raise your hands. Anybody texting at this point? A few textures. Okay, that's great. Is anybody postcarding at this point? A few people are more than a few people are postcarding. A lot of people are postcarding. Great. How about phone banking? After door knocking, phone banking is generally believed to be the most effective way to convince people to go to the polls and vote for the candidates of our choice. Okay, that's great. There are a few people who may not have raised their hands. I couldn't follow it all, to be perfectly honest. This was not what I'd call a scientific survey, but it does give us an idea. There are people who, most of us are already working. So the question now is going to be, how much harder can we work? So let's get ready to hear about Wisconsin. We've been joined tonight by two guests who are leaders in the fight to make Wisconsin blue in November. Two people who are intimate with the political ground game in the state and in its largest city, Milwaukee. JP Thomas is the voter protection organizing manager for the Wisconsin Democratic Party. He's the man responsible for making sure Wisconsin votes are secure, if by mail or if in person, in a state that has gone to great lengths to make it tough to vote, especially during this pandemic. Angela Lang is the executive director and founder of BLOC, Black Leaders Organizing for Communities, which has been working in Milwaukee's Black neighborhoods since 2017. So I'd like to begin actually by asking Angela to talk a little bit about BLOC, because it was founded on the basis of one of those theories, why Wisconsin flipped the wrong way last time. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone for joining. A little bit about BLOC. I love being able to tell this story. In 2016, we can run through the numbers. I really should tattoo 22,748 on my forehead. That is the number of votes that Donald Trump won the state of Wisconsin by. And just like everyone else, I was devastated by the outcome of the election. Definitely thought I was out of a job. But then also was really, really frustrated at the fact that our community was being blamed for the outcome of the election. We were some of the most disenfranchised and least engaged, but yet we were somehow to blame. And I thought that was incredibly frustrating and offensive and misguided, and that if anybody is to be blamed for the outcome of this election, it is the folks that voted for the man. And so we really thought about, what does it look like to get some folks in a room and really just hash out, what does a long-term infrastructure look like that's dedicated to doing outreach to the Black community with folks from the community on a year-round basis, and really taking all the lessons learned of what we've seen with organizations being transactional, only coming in a couple weeks or couple months before an election, really trying to take all the lessons learned and really kind of shift that on its head, and making sure that we're building civic engagement. We're bringing in more and more people. Unfortunately, in the state of Wisconsin, if you are still what we call on paper or on probation or parole, your voting rights aren't restored yet. We want to bring those folks along. There's still stuff that they can do to be civically engaged. So really just trying to raise the consciousness and the awarenessness of how people can really make a change in this political system that, quite frankly, wasn't designed for us to participate in. I think you're muted, Nick.
I said, what you did was, what you've managed to do with BLOC is take the lessons of community organizing a la Saul Alinsky and marry them to strategic electoral politics, which is really smart. It's very exciting to see it happening in Milwaukee. What's happened in Milwaukee's Black neighborhoods on the north side since you started doing your work?
Yeah, so we always start every conversation, even if it's some of the more partisan conversations, but we always start with the question, what does it look like for the Black community to thrive? And I remember when we first started asking that question, people were confused. They were asking why we were, asking that. What did we really want? But what's really great is to make sure that people understand how they can get involved. So last year, we worked with Liberate MKE on the divestment campaign, divesting resources from the police department over a year ago. And to see, 100 people show up and testify at a city budget hearing is really unheard of. You really don't see that level of civic participation. Even in some areas, when we first started to do our field program in February of 2018, we told our folks that were helping design our universe, we wanted to layer in the low performing wards, the wards where there isn't high turnout at all. And it was for a spring election. People thought we were crazy and wasting our time. But in some of those same wards that we talked to, we were able to increase participation by upwards of 3%. So we're really trying to shift this power dynamic and really say, the power is with the people. You want our vote, come get our vote. You need to come talk to us. We have a program called a silent canvas where candidates and elected officials, they get a chance to shadow one of our organizers or ambassadors, and they're not allowed to talk. They're not introduced as an elected official. They're there just to listen. We've had 3 presidential candidates do it at that point, because I think we really wanted to make sure that we were leveraging the power that we had. Instead of, I think a lot of times people are in awe by candidates, and we kind of put candidates on a pedestal like pseudo celebrities, and we really want to shift that dynamic and that power, and that people really should be catering to us, our community, and our issues.
JP, your title is a little bit mysterious, even to me. So can you explain what you mean by voter protection in Wisconsin?
Yes, yeah. Well, it's also a little confusing to me too, so don't worry. But first, before I start, I just want to say how inspired by the work, Angela, that you've been doing, that I am. It's the foundational work that is going to make movements last over time and not in one election cycle. So I'm honored to be here with Angela, who's been doing the incredible work in Milwaukee and Wisconsin as a state. I was brought to the Wisconsin voter protection team 2 weeks before the April 7th election. And I was asked to run our voter protection hotline. And before that, my background is with organizing. I organized with the Elizabeth Warren campaign in Madison, and I've organized in the gun violence prevention space, as well as voting rights. And I did not truly understand exactly the extent of the systematic voter suppression that has been committed by Republicans in Wisconsin until I was hearing hundreds of voters talk about how difficult it is to have their voices heard in the lead up to the April 7th election. And voter protection, when I talk about voter protection, I think a lot of people think about it as winning lawsuits, of beating people in the courtroom, changing laws, things like changing the laws to be automatic voter registration, or to allow people with convictions to actually vote after they get out of jail. But a lot of times voter protection can be the legal side, but it's also a lot of the logistical aspects of how elections are run. We forget that it takes thousands of people across our state to run elections. That means it takes a municipal clerk. In Wisconsin, our elections are actually run at the municipal level. So there are 1,852 municipal clerks who actually run our elections. And voter protection while it means passing laws, it also means supporting those people who actually run our elections. It means offering support to clerks and pushing them to do the right thing of opening early vote locations. It means pushing them to do things like offering more drop boxes so people can vote by mail. And I think voter protection to me means finding the ways in our systems of democracy to lower the barrier of entry for people, and to make it easier for them to vote. Right now in Wisconsin, and you mentioned the question, Nick, about why we lost in 2016, and there are so many reasons about why we lost, but one that I like to touch on is a voter ID law that was implemented for the first time for a presidential election in 2016 that made it incredibly difficult for Black and brown communities to vote, for people who didn't have IDs, made it incredibly hard for students with student IDs to vote. And those are all things that, while they are voter suppression at the legal level, there's a lot of things that we can do as organizers to address these things, to educate people. And I think that, to me, in terms of what voter protection can be in these 66 days until the election, it doesn't necessarily just have to be laws, but it also can be organizing, convincing people to work at their polling locations, explaining the great work that BLOC does about teaching people how to vote by mail for the first time, and explaining to them how to get on the Wisconsin voting website. All those things are voter protection. And I think sometimes if we use a more holistic view of what is and isn't voter protection, we'll be able to do a lot more important organizing, and be more productive before elections as well.
Well, you mentioned the April 7th primary, which was probably one of the most notorious elections, maybe in American history. It really was, in that election, the Republicans were able to use the pandemic as a tool in their voter suppression playbook. Voters had to choose between voting and risking their health. What happened in Milwaukee, Angela?
Yeah, what we saw in Milwaukee were incredibly long lines. I tell this story often. I woke up at about 7:15, like a good millennial. First thing I do is reach for my phone and scroll Facebook, and my whole feed was just heartbreaking pictures and videos, lines wrapping around the block, around parking lots, around schools, people in walkers. There were some folks of mine that I know who have disabilities that were posting and that said, I don't know if I can stand in this line for 2 hours. It rained for a little bit briefly in the afternoon while people were standing and waiting outside. There were a lot of folks, even some on our team, who did everything right, requested their ballot within the deadline, and for whatever reason, still didn't get their ballot. So they were faced with that decision on Tuesday. We heard a lot of that, whether it was from our team, the folks that we connected with out in the field, or even some of my friends and family. They were inboxing me saying, Angela, I requested my ballot. Is there a postmark date or is there not? Because at one point there wasn't. So if it came later, then as long as it was still in by the deadline, then it was fine. But once they added that postmark date back and it had to be postmarked by election day, you can't postmark something you never got. And so people were really just trying to figure out, do I risk my health and make my voice heard, or do I sit this one out? It was also a few weeks before the state, or a few weeks after the state had really started to shut down. We personally shut down our office on March 18th, and this election was on April 7th. So it was just a couple weeks after, it really got serious in Wisconsin. So not everyone even had a mask at the time. People were making masks and, giving them out. That's how I got my first mask. A friend of mine made mine. They weren't readily available. There was very little social distancing. It was very difficult to social distance because we normally would have 180 or so polling places, and we had 5. So we had to get out the word that people's polling places likely would have changed, but then also let people know what that is and to be prepared for long lines. But oddly enough, we saw some of the turnout numbers stay the same or not go as drastically bad as we thought. Ultimately, we ended up winning the state Supreme Court seat, which is bittersweet because a lot of the work that we did around the state Supreme Court or our school referendum, while they passed, we knew that this election came with a cost. But I think some people also were very just sick to the fact that they were forced to vote in a pandemic. The Republicans weaponized a global pandemic as a means of voter suppression to further retain power. And I think that was the line in the sand for some people. So I think people kind of went out and said, you know what, enough is enough. And I'm gonna actually vote out of rebellion at this point too, which on one hand was really inspiring to see, but it was also very heartbreaking, again, knowing that it came with a cost.
So JP, if most of the polling places were closed on April 7th in Milwaukee, what's going to happen on November 3rd? And what about early voting in Milwaukee? Are the Democrats working to expand the number of polling places that'll be open?
Yes. So to give everyone some more background on why those polling locations were shut down, as I mentioned before, our elections are run by people. A lot of times they're volunteers. And those volunteers who step up and run our elections and be poll workers are oftentimes people who are older, 70 plus. I think more than 60% of our poll workers are above the age of 65, which of course is the age of high risk for COVID. So hundreds of people were telling the Milwaukee clerk that they could no longer be poll workers. So they had to scale down massively in order to figure out a plan in which to work with the poll workers that they had. So in response to that, after the April 7th election, we turned around our program and started focusing our number one priority on poll worker recruitment. So we've been spending months. We do 2 trainings a week for poll workers to get them set up to be poll workers. And we've been training hundreds of people to learn about the need for poll workers and to step up so that we don't have the same lack of polling locations on November 3rd. It is still a major issue, something that we work on every day. It's a major issue. There are thousands of poll workers that are still needed for November 3rd. But luckily, we've been working hard at building capacity over the summer. So for example, on August 11th in Milwaukee, there was able to be 160 polling locations opened. And we are working to make sure that every city and town across Wisconsin has the number of poll workers that they need, but it is a major need. So one of the big reasons why that's difficult for a team like mine is because traditionally the Democratic Party doesn't spend that much time and effort on recruiting poll workers. Traditionally, it's focused on recruiting poll observers, who are the people who are our volunteers, who are on the ground, being our eyes and ears in and outside of polling locations. So as we recruit people in state to be poll workers, that's why there's such a need for people from Illinois, from Minnesota to step up and help us as poll observers. So it's almost doubled what we've had to recruit for in terms of what the party's been needing. But we are hoping that we'll be able to have many more polling locations open, and we're trying to fully open the entire state in terms of number of polling locations. But the interesting piece of all of this is the vote by mail. Because in April, we traditionally in Wisconsin have about 5 or 6% of people voting by mail. On April 7th, we had closer to 70% of people voting by mail. So it's a drastic change in the technical aspect of how our elections are run. So that means that poll workers, while we still need them to be there in person and open up all these polling locations, they're going to have to, instead of helping people vote in person, they're going to have to count absentee ballots that are coming in that are sent to these polling locations. So it's a new type of training for a lot of these poll workers. So that's why it's so important for us to get as many in as possible so that these clerks can train to make sure that people are up to speed for November 3rd.
That's a big menu. It's tough. But you've given us a clue as to one of the things that people from here in Chicago and Illinois might be able to do to give you a hand going forward. And we'll talk about that more as we go through the rest of the evening. I'm curious about what both of you think you're expecting from the Republicans going forward. Anything in particular to Wisconsin?
I expect something. I don't know what. I joke around and tell people I didn't wake up on January 1st thinking at some point this year we'd make an enemy out of the postal system. But here we are, right? I also didn't expect Kanye West to throw his hat in and try to run for president to siphon votes away. So like we're living in some weird times, but we've seen the Republicans literally weaponize a global pandemic as a means of voter suppression. And I can imagine that they're going to continue those tactics. I think ultimately at the end of the day, they're going to try and maybe just confuse people and really try to essentially just try to delegitimize the election, try to have people cast doubt in the election. If it's going to be, you know, longer than expected, we're not going to know the election results at about 11 or 12 o'clock anymore. It's probably going to be several weeks before we find out the election results. And we're already starting to see this president speak very dangerously to try and underhand and undercut the election results to inoculate in case he loses. Which means to me, it really reeks of desperation on the part of the Republican team. But ultimately, I think they're going to try and just confuse people as much as possible. They're going to try and screw with any deadlines. They're going to try and appeal this current lawsuit that's supposed to be decided any day now. I can imagine some other legal challenges. It's not going to be as easy as, you know, the lawsuit sets the boundaries and the parameters, and then we're going to stick to them. They're going to do everything that they can to try and undercut, you know, maybe even use misinformation. You know, we've seen how Russian bots played a role in 2016. So you know, we're kind of prepared for anything at this point. We didn't expect that our first presidential cycle as an organization would be this complicated. We knew we'd be up for a challenge because it's our first. But you know, we're at this point where we're just kind of adapting to whatever is getting thrown at us. You know, we were ready to pivot in case Kanye did end up getting on the ballot. I spent way too much time in the last few weeks talking about Kanye West to reporters and writing op-eds. But, you know, I think the great part about doing 6 months or so of quarantine is that we've been able to adapt and be very nimble and be very flexible these last few months and really kind of prepared for any underhandedness that inevitably will come our way.
Gerrymandering has really distorted Wisconsin politically by giving Republicans a very significant legislative majority, even though they got only a minority of actual votes statewide. What are the Democrats doing now to prevent the development of, you know, further gerrymandering? How can you restrain it? And what's on the agenda? Is this part of voter JP?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of gerrymandering, it is, I think as someone who's worked with a couple of organizations that have focused on this, it's difficult because the laws are made every 10 years. So you don't get many shots at this in terms of fixing our maps. And Wisconsin's maps are going to be redrawn in the next year and a half. So we are in a very crucial moment in terms of gerrymandering in the state of Wisconsin. And one very important piece was, as always is with gerrymandering issues, is electoral wins. Because when we're able to put our folks in there, we're able to stop some of the worst forms of gerrymandering. And that's why it was so important that we win the governor's seat in 2018. And that provides our party an ability to veto some of the worst possible maps that can be coming out of the Republican leadership. But because of that importance of that veto, we cannot lose the supermajority. We cannot lose to the Republicans the supermajority in the Assembly and the state Senate, because if we do, then they will be able to push through the similar maps, same maps, even worse maps than we currently have.
How close are they to a supermajority now?
So in both chambers, they're 3 seats away from a supermajority. So we've been working with the Senate Dems and the Assembly Dems. We have a program called Save the Veto, where we're working to try to make sure that we pick out a couple of really important local races. And you can find the information on those races if you just Google Save the Veto, Democratic Party of Wisconsin, and make sure that we win those areas that we really think that we're going to be able to flip from Trump, and those seats that have traditionally been held by Republicans, because these maps are so bad. So looking at the numbers, Democrats won 53% of the popular vote in 2018, yet they still almost give up a supermajority to the Republicans. So these maps are so screwed up that we need to really pick races that we can win and invest down ballot. And that's something that we've really been focusing on with our Save the Veto campaign.
You know, the dramatic and horrible events in Kenosha over the last few days are reframing the November election as we speak. Republicans are using them to scare white folks into believing that they're in danger and that chaos is afoot everywhere, and that Democrats are all in for chaos. They're using the unrest to frame this election around law and order, and neglect that it was a police shooting that prompted the protests and unrest in Kenosha. They ignore that a 17-year-old white youth with a semi-automatic killed 2 demonstrators, and they ignore that police had done nothing to clear the vigilantes that he was with. So Angela, I know this is very fresh and disturbing, but I wonder what you can tell us about what your ambassadors are hearing as they speak to people on the ground in Milwaukee.
Yeah, I think ultimately everyone feels a little rattled, I guess is the term that I'll say, because Kenosha is what we call down the street. It's only about 40 miles away from Milwaukee, and it's also familiar at the same time. We've seen these instances. A lot of us even have our own stories of interactions with the police. You know, even myself as a teenager, I'd been racially profiled before. We all have that familiarity of what it means to see those flashing lights. And you know, what I think this has been bringing up, not just with what happened in Kenosha, but with the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, is that we're seeing a lack of leadership on the national level. Usually when there is some sort of national tragedy, usually we don't have back-to-back national tragedies like we do in 2020, but usually when there's some sort of tragedy, the president has some sort of comforting words, at least feigning some sort of interest in unity, and not in the sense of, oh, there's good people on both sides, including referring to Nazis, right? And so I think people are seeing that this president doesn't care about our safety or our well-being. And that's one thing. It's also, he's activating a very, very dangerous base. You know, I wish I could say that I was surprised by the 3 people that were shot the other night and the 2 people that were killed, because this is what they've been waiting for. And a lot of us knew long before we turned on the news this morning, we knew exactly the type of person he was. We knew he was a Trump supporter. We knew he was a Blue Lives Matter person long before the news ever reported it, because this is what this presidency is breeding. He is breeding this, and he's, you know, it's not a dog whistle at this point. It's a full-on bullhorn. We hear the racism, and, you know, it's one thing to be silent on these issues. It's another to continue to perpetuate it and to make it worse. I hate to say this, but later on this evening, if I can stomach it, I'm gonna try and watch the president's acceptance speech, because I'm really interested to see if he will continue to talk about it or continue to not provide any action. And so I think a lot of people are frustrated and don't see this administration as someone and one that's friendly to our community, and quite frankly incites violence against us. It's one thing to not have any policy, it's another to be inciting violence.
It's still early, and the meaning of the events is still probably settling in people's minds slowly. But I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about what the implications are for your efforts to get people engaged and ready to vote.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways that it could go. Anytime there's a tragedy like this, it either makes people more solidified and fortified and more determined to vote, or it turns people off the opposite direction and said, you know what, after I vote, it doesn't matter, because people are still going to get gunned down in the streets. And so we live somewhere a little bit in the middle. We want to be honest with our folks and tell them voting is incredibly important. We need to use every tool and tactic in our toolbox as part of a broader strategy. And voting is a very important tool. And we want to make sure we're not selling our folks a pipe dream that if you just vote in November, everything will go back to normal and it'll be fine. We want to tell people, look, this is just step one. And then no matter what, because white supremacy existed long before 2016, and it's going to exist long after 2020, no matter what the outcome is. Even if Vice President Biden is elected, there's still a lot of work to do. And so we want to make sure that we're having holistic and full conversations with folks and letting people know that voting is just the first step. We want to make sure that we're taking that step and we're taking everybody with us on that journey, but we need to make sure that we're staying focused in the long term if we actually want that level of change that we want.
It's so important if the wind can blow either way, as you just described, that there are organizations like BLOC that are going to take leadership and say, voting is really important. Mm-hmm. If that isn't heard from credible people from the community, not just from politicians, but from credible neighbors, it's not going to be heard. I wonder, now I've lost my place.
I have one thing
yeah,
I just wanted to add on there for everybody listening. I think that like the point that Angela made is so important about investing in our in the communities that are impacted the most. And oftentimes as allies, the thing that is needed is investment, is giving organizations that are run locally, that are run just like Angela does with BLOC, and give them the resources they need to build power, because this organizing work cannot be done without resources. It can't be done by telling people to go and vote as the only solution. It has to be done by giving investment and money to the organizations that are building the power on the ground. And I think that like oftentimes, sometimes we get picked up in the 2-year cycle of campaigns. And of course, it's something I've given my life to, but I think that like in terms of creating real lasting change, investing in organizations that are doing this work, that are run by the communities themselves, is just super important. So yeah, just wanted to add that on.
Yes. JP, I'd just like to ask you to follow that by talking about the voter security and voter protection implications of what's happened in Kenosha from your perspective.
Yeah, and I think, so I, from my background, I actually came to work in Wisconsin from the gun violence prevention movement. And I experienced a lot of organizing around super high tensions and a lot of hate and a lot of people armed to the gills. And it's really scary to worry about your own safety when you're trying to organize, when you're trying to bring people together. And it's something that can almost put this weird blanket on the work that we're doing by scaring people to go outside and vote, to go outside and organize their communities, because they worry about their own safety. And that's something that I wake up every morning thinking about voting in Wisconsin. And one of the things that I worry the most about is voter intimidation. And I think that the voter intimidation machine that Donald Trump is putting together directly, and as Angela mentioned, indirectly, by riling up militias across areas that really don't, if they're riled up, will cause a lot of violence and hurt people. And I think that voter intimidation is something that I worry about all the time. And I worry that as we get closer to election day, you may have heard about all these drop boxes that we're going to be having across Wisconsin. I worry that those will become areas for intimidation, that people will be there and try to scare people away from voting, will try to look at people with different colored skin and say, no, you can't vote, you're not from here. And I think that that's something that I really worry about in regards to the increased tensions that are in Wisconsin right now. But I think that in terms of ways to that things that we can do and act to address these things are, one, we need to call on our local officials to step up and do the right thing. A lot of times those municipal clerks, your local mayors, city councils, they're the ones who can really create barriers to some of these bad things from happening and can step up and give resources to where they need to go. So I think in terms of like what we can do, one, you can volunteer to be a poll observer and help us find out where these problems are so that we can deal with them. Two, I think local advocacy in terms of in your local community, figuring out ways that you think voter intimidation might possibly happen, that you can address it with people who are like-minded. And lastly, I think a lot of us, for people who are all over the country, pick a state that matters a lot to you. Obviously, I would love if you would pick Wisconsin, but invest your time. We have less than 70 days until the election, and nobody wants to wake up and feel that feeling of horror that we all felt in 2016. And now's your chance to make a difference and to make a change and do something about it. So in terms of what we can do, I think it means that we need to take action right now, and we need people to be out there observing the polls for us. And we need to be creative in organizing and during this age of COVID. It's not going to be easy, but we can do it if we work together on it. I think you're muted again, Nick.
Thank you, JP and Angela, and thank you for your advice on mutations. It's a great note to end this portion of the program on. There are already a lot of comments and questions in the chat. I want to encourage people to enter more now so that Cecilia's job of sorting them out and figuring out which are the right ones to cover as we go through this is even harder. While you're doing that, I want to turn the program over to Dick Durning, who's got an important message that actually I think is going to build a bit on what JP just said. Dick?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, JP, you articulated so much of what I wanted to, what I will probably echo during this brief chat. And our message could not be more simple. It says we're just inviting each of you to join us in digging deeper and working harder. So I'd like to take a brief moment and just reflect a bit in terms of, since 2016, there have been a lot of incredible Wisconsin success stories. We'll start with Angela and her team, her BLOC team. We'll remember the fact that Joe Karofsky won the state Supreme Court slot. The work of voter registration pre-virus in Milwaukee was a stupendous success, where we were partnering with different friends in terms of the voter registration. And then also it's just, you know, listening to the work that you are currently doing, JP, with the voter protection is very, very exciting. What I want to just take a quick moment and just recognize that they're in this evening's gathering and part of this. And so fact is, though, that as we all know, in 2 months, 2 grueling months, then the election is going to take place. And we can't let up, and we have to accelerate our work. So what I would like to do is circle back in terms of how can we dig deeper? And echoing JP is that, you know, we need to dig deeper in lending support. And one of the things that I wanted to build on was in terms of BLOC, is that the support that we are giving BLOC not only is going to help support what they are doing currently, but when we win Wisconsin, I'm thinking positively, this is going to be a building block for BLOC to be able to build on this in terms of empowering the community. And so the donations that we give is not only current, but it's more long-term, and it's very exciting. And the other area is in volunteering. And so what I would like to do is invite you to see the link, which is connecting with the Chicago Indivisible Alliance. And there you will find this choices in terms of volunteer involvement. And specifically, the beauty of that is that there are a lot of choices where we can get engaged. Starting with phone banking. Often when we think of phone banking, we think of, you know, making phone calls for candidates, which is very true. We're making phone calls now in Michigan and Wisconsin for some progressive down ballot candidates, but also for senatorial races. So the beauty of this menu that the Chicago Alliance has created is that there are a variety of phone banking options, not only in terms of doing following and supporting candidates, but there are other things you can do in terms of direct service. There's phone banking going on in terms of voter registration in Wisconsin and in Michigan, and there's also incredible support and training that the Alliance does. So this is the beauty of that, is it has it for various levels of interest, of time, and of experience. And so check that out. And then I'm going to add one more thing that is taking place. This just began 2 weeks ago. And there now is a voter, there's a Wisconsin voter registration going on, which is a 1 month initiative, wherein this is going on not only in terms of Wisconsin, but is also going on in Michigan. And what this is, through a variety of capacity to just begin to winnow down non-voters, non-registered voters, that there's a system where they have found up to over 100,000 non-voters that have been initially a 2-stage process where they are being contacted currently about registering. But there is now phone banking going on in terms of follow-up, wherein we're making phone calls and helping individuals navigate the registration. So this is a blitz in September, but what this can do is translate to numbers. And what I mean by that is that they can project, and this came from a voter registration that took place in Texas with Beto's campaign. And from that 100,000, that they can project that there will be 30,000 new registered voters or renewed registered voters. And from that, there's a 72% probability that those will vote, which translates to 21,000 people. So do the math, or knowing that it was so close to Wisconsin, that there are things going on not only in terms of this registration, but the work that Angela is doing is quantifiable. People are contacting neighbor to neighbor, and things are happening. So in advance, thank you for both listening to me, but thank you for supporting and stepping into volunteering.
Thanks, Dick. Cecilia, are you ready to roll?
Yes, we've got lots and lots of good questions here. Let me open up my document here. All right. One really basic question, I think, for people who are inexperienced. Someone is asking, what does phone banking for Voter Protection Wisconsin actually involve? I guess this is for JP.
Yeah, I'll take this one. I know that we actually have one of our phone bank leads on this call from Working Wednesdays. So I'm sure she could do a great job at this too. But basically what we're doing with our voter protection team is calling through lists of former voter protection volunteers or really strong Democrats who are under the age of 50, and asking them to be poll workers and asking them to be poll observers. And what we're doing is we're calling people who are friendly and asking them to come and be volunteers with us. Traditionally, the people who we call are in Wisconsin and some of the target areas that need the most poll workers. And it's something that we really try to do to make sure that, as you heard about April 7th, all those polling locations that shut down, we're really trying to recruit those poll workers to make sure that those polling locations can be open this November.
Thank you. Another question I think that's related to this, someone is asking, I'm signed up to phone bank in Wisconsin. Will you be focusing on down ballot positions as they're currently doing in Michigan? And then
Yes.
a related question, what are the 3 key assembly races?
Yeah, so because we are now, our team, kind of the way that these presidential campaigns work is the presidential campaign teams up with the state Democratic Party and they create a coordinated campaign. And that coordinated campaign works for Democrats up and down the ballot. So when we call folks, we're not only talking about Joe Biden, we're also talking about all the races down ballot that are important in Wisconsin. So yes, we will be calling about down ballot races as well. In terms of the 3 legislative races, I don't have them off the top of my head, but if you send me an email at jp@wisdems.org, I'll follow up and give you the list of our Save the Veto races so you can have it in one spot.
Thank you very much. I have another question. Let's see, here we go. With a very, very large Black Lives Matter protest, is this causing African Americans who may not have previously voted to be more likely to vote in November? Does anyone have any data on this? And what's BLOC's sense of this?
Yeah, we don't have any data on that specifically. People have been testing since the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. People have been testing out the popularity of this movement, defund versus divest type of language. But we haven't tested out specifically. I think what will be interesting to have a Wisconsin focused, research or testing, specifically given what's happened in Kenosha, and if that changes anything. Honestly, I can see people. There was an article that came across my feed right before this call, so I only got a chance to skim it. But it already is, I think the title of the article said something about it is framing the outcome of the election. I think depending on what side people are on, it's gonna, kind of solidify them even more. If people are super pro Blue Lives Matter, and Trump continues to do this bullhorn yelling of activating his people, that could be potentially helpful for his side. I also think people understand the urgency of this moment, and that even if folks may have had a little bit of an enthusiasm gap with the Biden and Harris ticket, I think people understand that our lives are at stake, and that we're, quite frankly, literally being murdered and gunned down in the middle of the streets, and there isn't a national outcry from this administration. And I think people feel that. I think generally a lot of what I know about campaigns went out the window in 2016, but from like my former campaign manager hat, one of the things that you don't do is you don't piss off voters. If you're trying to win an election, generally you don't piss off the voters. But I feel like this is happening. It's not like these protests are going to be such a distant memory. We're only 2 or so months away from the election. And seeing an attack on our bodies in such an intimate and, quite frankly, terrifying way, I don't think is something that people are really going to forget or really let slide when it comes to this administration.
Thank you. I have one more question, I think, for you, Angela. How is BLOC reaching Black voters given the pandemic?
Yeah, so like a lot of other organizations, we had to move completely digital. So we made the decision on March 16th that effective March 18th, we would be shutting down our office. So we had about 48 hours to completely uproot our program and to get things like virtual phone banks up and running, to get, programs like Hustle, to do text messages. I'm familiar with both of those things from previous lives, but as an organization, we didn't have accounts with either one of those just because our bread and butter was being able to be out in the field. So at the time, we had to train nearly 50 people when we first started on how to use virtual phone banks and Hustle. We have since grown our team to 75. So we're able to get through our list of texting and phone banking rather quickly. And then I'm not comfortable with our team having face-to-face canvassing conversations, but they are really eager to get back out in the field. So I compromised a couple weeks ago ahead of our August election, and said that they could literature drop. So they could take a piece of literature, stick it in the door, do not knock, do not ring any doorbells, literally just stick the literature in the door and keep it moving. And we were able to, in about 4 days or so, and not even having our full team go out because we didn't force anyone, we were able to hit over 11,000 doors with that early vote location information just in a couple days. So we're thinking about continuing to do some of those things in the field. Not quite comfortable with fully having them face-to-face conversations, but we were well received in the community. People were thanking us. One of our leads registered someone to vote on the spot when she was walking down the street. But our focus is texting and phone banking, and then getting creative with our digital work. Is there a way to kind of prime the same list that we're going to text and phone bank and target them with a digital ad saying, hey, we're going to be calling you soon or texting you soon, because we know that people are probably getting a lot of calls and text messages from different organizations, and we want to make sure that our contact rates stay rather high, and we kind of break through that. So playing around with some digital tactics as well.
Thank you very much. See, I have a fairly general question here, maybe for JP, although I'm not sure. For those in touch with the Biden and Harris campaign, does anyone know if they're planning to visit Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania early and often? I know, then this person continues, Biden has been in touch with Blake's family, but what about the general population?
Yeah, so really good question. I know it's something that we've been, I think, all presidential campaigns have been struggling with is in-person events. Right now, we truly believe the best way that we can gain people's trust is by keeping people safe and by not having in-person events that will spread COVID. Because we've seen time and time again when Donald Trump has shown up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin, that the COVID cases have risen. So right now we are focusing on building capacity, and we do have events with Vice President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, or soon to be Vice President Kamala Harris, in Wisconsin, but in a digital space. And I'm hoping that things get to a place where we can have a lot of in-person events and people can come to Wisconsin. But our priority right now as a campaign is to keep people safe. So if that means that we can't have in-person events, we're going to find ways to organize and be creative and win this thing. But again, I am a lowly voter protection person in Wisconsin, so I do not have any control or really know much about Joe Biden's plans in terms of his schedule. But I know right now, in terms of what we are prioritizing as a campaign, is keeping people safe and making sure that we can organize in a way that meets everyone where they are.
I think one thing I would add to that, I had to just double check and look it up. At about 6 o'clock this evening, there was an event. Specifically, it was a roundtable discussion for Black men. And there's a couple celebrities and some entertainers. And it also featured our Lieutenant Governor as well. But it was really, based off of my understanding of it, it was a roundtable focused on issues impacting Black men in Wisconsin. And so what we're seeing is that we're seeing these targeted events that are more on the virtual side. Again, I don't know about the campaign. I'm incredibly walled off from the campaign, so this is all public knowledge from what I'm seeing. But I think they're starting to get strategic on how they're doing these virtual events, and not just having them be big and broad, but virtual for the state of Wisconsin or virtual for Detroit and et cetera. So I think we're going to probably see more of that if I were to guess.
Thank you, JP and Angela. I have a question here. Do you know whether sorting machines and mailboxes have been removed in Wisconsin? And if so, is there a strategy for dealing with that?
Yes, so that's a great question. So there has been a couple of reports of sorting machines and mailboxes being removed in Wisconsin. I think a lot of people probably heard Postmaster General's DeJoy's statement that said they are pausing all of these things from happening, but I don't trust that at all. I think that in terms of what we can do to make a difference is we need to make as much noise and be as loud as we possibly can about when we see these things happening in our local communities, and particularly in Wisconsin. One thing that we're doing on our voter protection team is really encouraging drop boxes. So right now, there's a law in Wisconsin where voters or a family member or a friend can drop off absentee ballots at a local drop box. That drop box doesn't have to go through the USPS system. And by dropping your ballot off at a drop box, you're taking some of the pressure and the load off of the USPS. So what we're trying to do, as I mentioned, there are 1,852 municipal clerks in Wisconsin. Each of those clerks gets to decide how many and where those drop boxes are. So we have a big project ahead of us to call all those clerks and find out the location of each of those drop boxes so that we can make it public access and people can know where those drop boxes are so that they can take some of that pressure off of the USPS. So that is one project that we're working on. And if you'd like to join me in that project, please send me an email. I would love your help. But in terms of things that you can do, be loud. Don't fall for the Republican traps of, oh, this isn't happening, because it is, and it will continue to happen. And 3, we need to educate voters on how to vote effectively and use things like drop boxes if they're available for them.
There was a related question to that, JP. Do people have to use the drop boxes that are tied to their own precinct or area, or can they use any drop box anywhere?
So it depends by state. So I wouldn't feel comfortable giving you any advice for Illinois. But in terms of Wisconsin, the way that we run our drop boxes is they're run by municipalities. So if it's in your city or in your town, you can use it. But if it's in somebody else's city or somebody else's town, you cannot. And then all those ballots get brought over to the clerk's office, and then the clerk will organize them. But I wouldn't feel comfortable on giving any advice for Illinois. I apologize.
Great, thank you. I've got, I think, one more question here. Does anybody have any guesses or any hard data on how many more votes are needed to flip Wisconsin compared to, let's say, the last election?
Well, I'll say that Trump only won the state of Wisconsin by 22,748 votes. So that is such a small margin of error. I learned just actually before this call that Kenosha, went red by less than 250 votes. And so I think there's a lot of variables at play. I think, I don't think anybody has like a hard number at this point. I think folks have like a targeted number based off of statewide turnout and whatnot. But I think there's so many dynamics that I think it's going to be hard to get any data because there are some people that said that they didn't support Trump in 2016, but they may support him now, or vice versa. And so people are canceling each other out at this point. And we're seeing that there's such a strong sense of urgency. We're also really kind of concerned about misinformation. There's an enthusiasm gap. We're still in a pandemic, despite people thinking that it's over because they're bored with it. It's still a pandemic. I think there's a lot of different tactics that and variables that I think are in play. So I think it's really hard to tell. What I will say when it comes to my own lane and my work and my job is that I do think that Black voter turnout will increase. It dropped in 2016 by roughly 19%, but it dropped statewide by about 3%. So we're doing the best that we can to increase Black voter turnout. And with it honestly being 19% drop off, there's really no place to go but up. So I'm hopeful that we can increase Black voter turnout. And there's also just more infrastructure that exists that didn't exist in 2016, not just necessarily BLOC, but another organization called Leaders Igniting Transformation, who really targets youth of color. And so, by having more and more boots on the ground than were in 2016, I do think that we're able to increase turnout. Does that mean, however, that Wisconsin goes back blue? I think that's yet to be determined.
Thank you. JP, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, that was pretty much it. I think the 22,000 or so, when you break that down by polling location, that's 10 votes per polling location.
Wow.
So it's not very much, and I think a lot of people think that Donald Trump had this phenomenal year in 2016 in Wisconsin, but he did worse than almost every other presidential campaign had ever done in Wisconsin in the century. He did worse than Romney. He did worse than Obama both times. He did worse than George W. Bush both times, worse than John Kerry. So I think, as Angela mentioned, that enthusiasm gap is so important because it's not like Donald Trump was getting out thousands and thousands of more people in Wisconsin. We didn't turn out. And that's something that we need to do to get those 10 votes by polling location.
Well, this is all sounding like it's something that's doable. Thank you. Dick, do you want to say any more words about volunteering and supporting before I close the meeting?
I think I'll share the mic with Nick. Didn't you want to say a few words?
Sure, thanks, Dick. I personally want to thank both Angela and JP because your work is so important to us and to the future of our country. So I want you guys to know how much we appreciate what you're doing. And I would argue that the best way for us to thank you is to volunteer and to contribute. You guys need help. Most of us are right here across the border, a short drive away. And if we weren't in the midst of the pandemic, many of us would be driving up to Kenosha to canvass. We've done it before. Instead, we're going to be making phone calls. And I hope everybody who hasn't started making phone calls will go to that website and sign up ASAP. Text, postcard, do everything you possibly can. Find the button at the bottom of the page of the 3 states, one strategy page on the website for Chicago Indivisible, and click the button that appeals to you most now. After you've done that, think about how you can help pass the fair tax here in Illinois and make a contribution to BLOC. I see that Lenny has put BLOC's donation link in the chat now. So don't go away without checking it out. Okay. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Thank JP and Angela for coming again and helping us out here in Illinois. It's so important to know about the hard work and good work that you guys are doing just north of the border.
Yes, and I would like to, before we close out, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this session, whether you are on Zoom with us or streaming on Facebook. And also, if you would like to suggest the next hot topic, please jot it down in the chat now, or send us a note through the Facebook page, the Indivisible Illinois 9 Facebook page after the meeting, or get in touch with one of us that you know. And finally, we know that if everyone pitches in, we can really win Wisconsin and we can win the White House. And we hope to see you again in September, and we wish you a good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.